continue to join us. I just got muted. There you go. We may have some members who will join us in the next few minutes, and that's okay. We have a few introductory items, but we certainly can catch folks up if we need to later on, but I do want to make sure we use the time wisely. Welcome back to the Civilian Review Board Work Group, meeting number 2. Today, we're really going to get into much more of the nuts and bolts about how we want to start to design a Civilian Review Board for our city of Columbus. And so there will be some initial presentation and discussion to kind of ground you in several elements of what other cities are doing. And then we will bring the conversation back to Columbus, and based on that knowledge, start to have conversations about some of the early structural pieces that we want to see for our own Civilian Review Board here. This will kind of be our working agenda for today. You probably have the full version in front of you as well. And so, again, welcome back to everyone. We're not going to do an official roll call, but Denise and folks on my team are taking notes of who is on the call, and I do have the members listed on the following slide. I do want to, in just a moment, kind of remind us again of our charge for the group and the responsibilities we've taken on as a part of the work group, so we'll review that early on. And then we'll get into 3 kind of distinct discussions this afternoon. The first being some background and overview of the power of Civilian Review Boards and the responsibilities they have in other cities. We believe it's important that you have some context for that, and then we'll bring the conversation back to Columbus and really think about what is the breadth and depth of the power and authority you want this group to have. And so we'll have that discussion as a part of the opening work group discussion. We also will spend some time talking about structure, things like how many members, things like how we will go about initially getting members in the board, what will be our ongoing appointment process. We want to hear your best thinking around those things. And then we'll talk about some different operational models. As you know, this will be a standalone department of sorts. There's some various models already working within city government. We might model this after. There might be some models in other cities as well we might think about. And so all those things are just food for thought, and we will work by them point by point to get your best thinking on record, and then start to kind of put the meat on the bones as it relates to the Civilian Review Board and how we want to structure it here for Columbus. We want to always leave some time for you all to bring up things we didn't talk about today and anything that's kind of on your mind pressing. And just like what you're going to hear from today from our friends at Baker and Hostetler, we also want to continue to keep the conversation open to other points of information you need, other data, other types of development you need in order to be able to do this work of the work group more effectively. So that's kind of our working agenda today. Hopefully that resonates with all of you, and then we'll have opportunity in for some closing remarks from our colleagues at the city. That said, I'll pause now. Kate, Matt, anything by way of opening you all have before we jump in today?
No, sir. Thanks everyone for coming on back, and we've got a lot to get to, so I think we should just jump in.
Okay. All right, so let me formally just welcome everybody back. This should be a running list of our work group members. Many of you are on the call today, so thanks for taking the time. As you see, we have scheduled the next couple of meetings. We're trying to be a little more aggressive than we originally thought, and so these meetings are popping up probably every 2 to 3 weeks versus every month, because we do want to make sure we allow enough time at the end that if there are unresolved components of how the Civilian Review Board will work, we want to allow you time to be able to deliberate over those things before our kind of November-ish time frame that we want to be done. So at least done with this initial design work at least. And part of that is so that the structure that you all put in place around getting members in place can actually have time to be implemented, and we can get a board seated by the end of the year, which is what the mayor shared at the first meeting as a goal. So we welcome back all members of the work group as well as our city support staff. Jason Jenkins, you'll be hearing from a little later in the meeting to talk a little bit about. Matt and Kate continue to be your kind of major points of contact along the way, so feel free to reach out from them. Alexa's joining us from Baker and Hostetler, so you're going to hear a lot from her in this early conversation today, and Chief Kim Paul is really keeping this as a pet project, given all his other responsibilities. We want to make sure that we have his continued input throughout the course of this process. With that said, let's get ready to jump into today's conversation unless there are questions from the work group.
No.
Good to go?
Yes, sir.
All right. Just a couple things by way of reminder. You'll recall why we're all here and what we're asking you to do. Ideally, we want to walk out of here with a strong recommendation, and I use recommendation loosely. It really is a plan to establish our independent civilian review board that is charged to do several things by way of the enabling legislation that is forthcoming. Investigate officer misconduct, recommend disciplinary action, provide a civilian oversight and accountability function for our Columbus Division of Police, and we want that to be all grounded in best practices both locally and nationally, including the expectations of our community, which a lot of that perspective is being represented through you in this process. We know this group will be charged with making recommendations. We're going to start today around thinking about how the board will be seated and structured. Also, there'll be an ongoing role for the eventual board to think about ongoing policies, procedures, and funding of this department in order to make sure that the work continues and serves its original purpose. So just a reminder of that charge we talked about in meeting one. You've also seen this before. We're saying at least 6 meetings. I would say at least at this point is probably the best way to describe it. We hope to have your indulgence to have as many meetings as we need without certainly not overcomplicating your schedule, but we want to have the right conversations and make sure we're coming up with the right outcome. You all are serving as advisors to the city on this matter, and we really want to hear your thinking throughout about what the community will be responsive to, and also how to make sure we maintain the teeth in this board that I know many of you have advocated for and are looking for from this process. And then just a reminder, as we went through extensively at our first meeting, because of the appointed body here, this is a group advising the mayor and the city. This is an open meeting. The meeting is being recorded as well as streamed. And so I want you to be reminded of those cautionary points from our initial meeting to know that what you say here, as well as communications around the work here, may be subject to open meeting laws and sunshine laws for the state of Ohio. So just a reminder of all of that. All right. Now that I've got all that out of the way, I'm going to give both the screen and the mic to Alexa from over at Baker Hostetler. We've asked Alexa, who's been working along with Ron on this project, to really overview several things. Really got to get into some of the details about what the power and authority of these groups look like around the country. So she's going to be sharing a number of data points along her presentation, as well as kind of revisiting some of the documents that we gave you after the meeting that Ron referenced. And so looking at those other cities, and we've really broken it down to look at various aspects of how those boards are put together, all as input. You can say, we love this model, we don't like this model, or we don't like any of it at all. But it is all input into your thinking. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we do want to invent a wheel for Columbus. And so we may find that some of those practices in other cities will serve Columbus well. So with that, Denise, if you will give control over to Alexa, and I will turn the presentation over to her. She'll have some points along the way. She can take your quick Q&A, and then at the end, it will come back and process all of what you heard and kind of pull out some of the really valuable pieces that you believe she needs to have or needs to discuss with you.
Thank you, Mo. Hi, everyone. As Mo said, I'm Alexa Sellier. Thank you very much for letting me speak with you all today. It's really great to be a part of this and to assist you in this great endeavor you have. A little background on me. I am a labor and employment associate at Baker Hostetler. And my experience with the criminal justice system would be when I clerked my first year out of law school for Judge Reeves in the Eastern District of Kentucky. And then I also did a summer internship with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Detroit. I'm originally from Indianapolis, so as you can see, I've lived in several different cities, but Columbus is what I call home now, I think for the long haul. So I'll get started by sharing my screen. Okay, can everyone see this? Let me know if you can't. Okay. Yeah. So as Mo mentioned, I'm going to talk about the civilian review boards in some of the large US cities. The topics we'll cover today are background and kind of the research that we did. Then we'll talk about the 3 common functions of civilian review boards, and we'll explore the complaint process for each of those models. And I'll use an example from each city. And then we'll talk about composition and structure. So a little background on what we did. We looked at the 17 largest cities plus Baltimore, and you might be asking yourself, why would we do that? 17 is kind of a weird number. Well, we were originally going to do 15, but then decided we should have some cities that are smaller than Columbus so that we can see some other options, because sometimes something that works in New York might not be for us since we're smaller. And then we chose Baltimore because the Community Safety Advisory Commission liked that model and recommended it. For source documents, we looked at city charters, executive orders, policies and procedures that the CRB created, labor contracts or memoranda of understanding with unions, and then news articles and law review articles. Now, we really tried to focus on city charters, executive orders, and labor contracts because we can trust that information the most. But in some cases, the cities don't have those documents as easily available. So then we had to rely on a few secondary sources, but we tried to vet those as best we could. So the 3 common types of CRBs, I think Ron spoke about this on August 4th with you all, so I don't want to go into too much detail. But there's the investigative, review, and auditor monitor. And the investigative function, we're really looking at boards that conduct independent investigations. So a lot of times they'll be fully staffed with investigators who have been trained, and they will work from the ground up doing witness interviews and things like that. And the result of these investigations can be 2 things. It can be discipline recommendations or actual implementation of the discipline. But usually you're going to see recommendations to police chief or police commissioner, depending on what you have in that city. For the review function, these cities typically will have internal affairs, IA, do the investigation, and then after they review it, the board will make a recommendation for discipline. And in these, you're usually not going to see just a straight decision that's implemented as far as discipline goes. And then the auditor monitor function is more focused on reviewing the investigations process, making sure that was fair, and then making recommendations on changes in policies and procedures for the investigation process. So that model typically has less teeth than the others. And I saw a comment about the Office of Inspector General. And I think that a lot of times that can be sort of a blend, but that can take on the investigative role, conducting an independent investigation. And I saw another comment about potentially needing more investigators. You would probably want a staff of multiple investigators to work under the independent or the Office of the Inspector General. So as far as common functions of CRBs, I know that Ron talked about this slide and the next one, so I don't want to go into too much detail. But when we were creating this chart, I want you to notice a few differences. For the audit function, we were thinking about that a little bit more in layman's terms. So a lot of times you'll audit just a sampling of complaints and investigations to see whether the overall process is fair, and you may not look at all of them. We also, I'll talk briefly about advising on policies and procedures. So most boards will make recommendations and will not actually unilaterally implement division directives or work rules. The subpoena power I know we would like to have, and that was in about a little bit over half of the jurisdictions. And I'll turn so you can see here. Another function that can be important is the mediation function. You may or may not want this, but from what I've seen in jurisdictions, it can be helpful because sometimes the citizens really want to be heard, and it can be helpful for the officer to actually put a face to what occurred and to really engage in that discussion and learn from what happened. So that can work for some of the maybe lesser misconduct. And then there's also reporting functions, reporting on, different types of maybe discrimination that has occurred or types of excessive force. And the community outreach and liaison functions are pretty similar. And so those are very important as far as putting officers in contact with the community in positive non-law enforcement capacities. And then lastly, with hiring, not too many boards have this power, but sometimes they can have input onto who's selected as chief or some of the higher positions. And sometimes they can decide who will be or what types of characteristics you'll want in new hires. So I selected for each of these functions 2 cities that I thought were good models of that particular function and maybe highlight some different aspects you might want to consider. So New York, of course, has a pretty robust civilian review board, and they have the power to receive and investigate, conduct independent investigations. They can compel attendance of witnesses, which is subpoena power, and they can recommend action on complaints. Now, what you'll commonly see are different categories of complaints that the Civilian Review Board can see rather than every single complaint. Part of this might be just volume, but a lot of times you will see excessive force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, offensive language, or truthfulness. Truthfulness can be important if the board encounters a cover-up situation and would like to add an additional charge for truth or untruthfulness that occurs during the investigation. So with New York's board, the board will forward to, let me see your question. Board will forward its findings to the police commissioner, who will provide a detailed explanation if he or she deviates from that recommendation. Now, this, as you can see, this adjudicatory power means that the board is just giving a recommendation, an advisory role, but this can hold the police commissioner more accountable because of that explanation that has to be provided. There's additional limits that a finding can't be based solely on an unsworn complaint, and that prior unsubstantiated, unfounded, or withdrawn complaints will not be the basis for a recommendation. Chicago also has a robust board, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, or COPA, and it can receive and register all the complaints of the police department, but then it only conducts investigations into some of those, like domestic violence, excessive force, abuse, improper seizure, or denial of access to counsel. Now, there's also a few that Chicago has that I wanted to point out that are different. Sometimes if a weapon is used, like a firearm, stun gun, or a taser, the chief administrator has discretion to review, for the board to review those. Also, officer-involved death, that is another one, another category. And then I put in bold here a couple things that are different about Chicago. I know a lot of cities have come under fire for large money amounts of lawsuits when an officer is accused of misconduct in a civil suit. And so the Chicago COPA board has the power to give their input as far as those settlements. maybe to make sure that they are appropriate. And this, I didn't create these charts. I pulled them from the Chicago COPA website, but they kind of show the process of a complaint. So you can see how that works under this model. The step one intake and classification process, we already pretty much talked about. So everything goes through COPA, but then COPA will only conduct investigations of certain complaints, and then internal affairs will do investigations of the other complaints. When you move to step two, for Chicago, an affidavit is usually required from the complainant. Now, this can be difficult to obtain sometimes, and there's a process for if there's objective evidence of what occurred where you may not need an affidavit. So that might be something to consider. And then the investigation process is, as you can imagine, involves conducting witness interviews, collecting evidence, canvassing the scene, and then making disciplinary findings and disciplinary recommendations. When you move on to this process, the part that I wanted to point out is sometimes it might be appropriate for a board to make a referral to other law enforcement agencies, particularly if the conduct might be criminal and more than just a violation of policy. So that's something to keep in mind. And for Chicago, they have 4 findings: sustained, not sustained, exonerated, and unfounded. So something to think about is what the burden of proof would be. Here you can see for officer-involved shootings, there's a preponderance of the evidence standard, just more likely than not, for finding sustained or not sustained. But in order to find that an officer's conduct, that it was exonerated, which means it was within policy, or that it was unfounded, which means that that conduct did not actually happen, then there's a clear and convincing evidence standard. And so that's a much higher burden. And then you can see they actually don't specify a standard for the non-officer involved shooting cases here. And then the next step, this chart I think might make it look a little more complicated than it is. But essentially the superintendent of the police department has the opportunity to tell COPA to conduct further investigation. If the superintendent does agree with the disciplinary recommendation, then there are 2 options. If it is lesser discipline, the officer will go under the regular collective bargaining grievance process. If it's suspension or termination, then the superintendent will file charges, and there's a process where another board, the Chicago Police Board, will then review and determine guilt or innocence. And that board is also composed of all civilians. And I had a question about whether a citizen can be charged with filing a false complaint. Chicago, I am not positive on that, but I can look into that. I know that is fairly common in different jurisdictions. And then if there is some disagreement between what the board has recommended and what the superintendent thinks should be done, then a member of the board of the Chicago Police Board will review that discipline. And ultimately, the superintendent can deviate, but will have to provide some type of explanation. So moving on to the review boards, the Houston Independent Police Oversight Board can review all internal affairs investigations that involve these categories: excessive force, discharge of firearms, and other major incidents, which has some room for ambiguity. And then also can review all disciplinary cases and make recommendations to the chief of police. And then an important function is having access to police department records. And the Charlotte Citizen Review Board is similar, but one aspect that is a little different is it actually reviews appeals of citizen complaints. So if there is not an appeal, then they will not review those. And they can actually conduct a hearing, but they have mostly an advisory role to the chief, city manager, and city council. And the way that works is that if the board determines the greater weight of the evidence is that the chief erred, then the chief reviews the recommendation and reports a new decision in 7 days, and the city manager takes action on that decision. So the chief still has the ability to deviate, but does have to spend some time thinking about and looking into whether that's the right decision. And this chart is a little bit harder to read, but it kind of shows the process of starting with the appeal and then the CRB meeting with internal affairs to potentially conduct a full evidentiary hearing. So even though they didn't conduct the investigation, they have the opportunity to speak with some witnesses. And then you'll see that if the CRB determines by the greater weight of the evidence the chief of police did not err, it's closed. And if the CRB determines that the chief did err, then you have that review process where the chief issues a new decision. And moving to the auditor function, LAPD Board of Police Commissioners is a good example of this. It sets overall policy while the police chief manages the daily operations. It also investigates the discrimination and harassment complaints within the department. So this is another thing to consider. Instead of just investigating citizen complaints, it also addresses employment discrimination issues that could be happening within the department. And then it has this officer of the inspector general function to oversee the internal disciplinary process and make recommendations on just changes to the process, not on actual discipline. But the inspector general does have the power to subpoena. And San Jose also has an independent police auditor that reviews professional standards, conducts unit investigations of certain complaints, excessive force, and then a sampling of 20% of other complaints. And it may interview civilian witnesses, but it can only suggest questions for officer interviews. So its function is a little bit limited in that way. The auditor can also request for the police chief or city manager to further investigate a matter. And then it participates in the review of officer-involved shootings and makes recommendations regarding policies and procedures. And I pulled this also from the San Jose website, talking a little bit about how the process works. Citizens can contact the auditor, and members of the public can also file claims with IA too. And usually the auditor will respond to the citizen and provide a summary. And then Internal Affairs will send the citizen a letter that tells them that the complaint has been received. But Internal Affairs will conduct the investigation and then forward that investigation to the auditor. And the auditor will examine it for fairness. So kind of switching gears here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure and composition of CRBs so we can think about how big you want the board to be, how long the term should be, what kind of candidates. Oh, yes.
Would you mind pausing here? I think just because you went through those three kind of distinct potential structures, and maybe take some questions first before we move to the more detailed structure stuff. There may be some questions, if not, feel free to move. For the group, any questions on what you heard around how other cities have approached, the power of the group?
Yeah, I have one. So under the investigation model where the office is doing more of the review, can you speak at all to the kind of breakdown between the IG's office and the Internal Affairs Bureau? And I'm also thinking about sort of size. So in cities that have taken on that more robust investigatory function under the civilian board, does that internally sort of resize and shrink down the IAB because they're taking on fewer cases? So if anything you can share there would be helpful.
So I don't know if I've looked so much at what happened with internal affairs, but when the inspector general or the board itself does conduct those investigations independently, the group does need to be pretty substantial. So you'll see a little bit later that some of these boards will have a staff of 150 people that has to be funded, and it will cost millions of dollars because these people are full-time employees. So I would imagine that internal affairs would shrink, but some of the boards will allow parallel investigations by internal affairs and then also by the board. So it may not always be the case that internal affairs will be smaller. But if you are thinking about just moving funding from one area to another, there might be some opportunities for that. Any other questions?
Hi, Jasmine. I have a question. I have two questions. So the first question is, any of the models that you reviewed, do you know how many of them have actually successfully gotten an officer fired and or convicted of a crime?
I don't have a specific number. What I can say is that there are a lot of challenges with these boards because first, there can be a lot of legal challenges that the union can bring about whether they were properly put in place or not. I know a smaller city as an example that you might want to look at is Newark in New Jersey, and it has been in years of litigation. So that can be one challenge. As far as, that's probably one of the biggest challenges. Some of the boards are not always some of them end up being more, how can I say this? Sometimes people think civilians will hold officers to a higher standard than internal affairs, but that has not always been shown to be the case. So that can be something that is not always expected.
Well, thank you.
Hey,
My
Alexa,
second question
Alexa,
is,
excuse me for. Hey,
go
Jasmine,
ahead,
hold on
Matt.
1 second. Sorry. At the next meeting, we'll have the president of the Chicago Police Board presenting to us. So that may be a question you may get to ask that individual. They may, be able to give you direct experiences. So I just wanted to make sure you knew that.
Cool,
Sorry to
thank you.
interrupt.
No problem. Next, my other question is, have any civilian review boards ever had the ability to pull someone's pension?
I have not seen that, but I've never specifically looked for it. So that's something I could look for.
Cool, thank you.
Alexa, I had a question about the burden of proof you described in the Chicago model. Is there any other precedent where the burden would be much lower for sustaining something versus exonerating? It seems like you use the model, the criminal justice system, for instance, we don't weight it one way or the other, right? Burden of proof is pretty level. And so I just wondered if that, and I understand this is outside the criminal justice system, this process, but I just wondered if there's any other sort of precedent for that.
Not that I'm aware of. It did strike me as a little bit odd, but I think probably the goal is to make sure if the goal is to make sure you're really holding officers accountable, to have that higher standard for when you're just going to totally exonerate them might make sense. But I could definitely see where perhaps the union would bring a lot of challenges to having two different standards.
Thank you.
Alexa, most often are you seeing, so if this were a board of, let's say, 12 or 15 people, would every member be involved in every investigation? Are there kind of subgroups and teams? How would, the Inspector General go about engaging the board in terms of that review and disciplinary process in what you've seen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in some of these bigger jurisdictions, the actual board members will have pretty limited involvement in the investigations. They'll set up the policies and procedures for the staff who's actually conducting the investigations, and then they'll come in and review the investigation report and then make their disciplinary recommendation. So I think they could be as involved as they want to be in the investigation. Like if they see a problem in the report and they think this investigator needs to go back and interview more witnesses or ask certain questions, But I think it's, as far as their capabilities with the volume of cases, they might just not have as much time to be fully involved in the investigative process.
Got it.
I'm sorry, I have another. Oh, go ahead.
Let's get Fred first, and then we'll come to Jasmine.
Is there any studies that show the effectiveness over one model versus that of another model? And then secondly, were any of these models fashioned alongside a consent decree?
Yes, so for the first one, as far as effectiveness goes, I think what I've seen is that usually the investigative model is the most effective if you can actually get it implemented and get past the litigation problems, because the board can actually, its factual findings are established based on its own investigation instead of having to rely on internal affairs. But the difficulty is actually getting that implemented. I think I've seen that the review model can be successful, especially if the board has the opportunity to direct further investigation if they see a problem. And then for your second question about the consent decree, I believe Chicago's involves a consent decree with the Department of Justice. And that's the only one I'm aware of right now. And then I mentioned a smaller city, Newark, that also had a similar situation with a consent decree.
Okay, thank you.
And then I think someone had
Jasmine,
another question.
Was that you jumping in there, Jasmine? I thought I heard somebody.
I was wondering if the board has a say in who the inspector general and investigators are, and sort of what parameters govern them. I see the investigative body being a subgroup of the civilian review board.
Yes, so I mean, you can do what you want. I saw some models where the board will actually agree by like a majority vote on who the inspector general will be. For example, there are some systems where the mayor would appoint and then the board would have to confirm. So you can definitely have the board be involved in that process if you want.
And Jasmine, that it's not today, but that is a specific decision point discussion we're going to have about the board's role in terms of selecting and evaluating the inspector general. So it may be meeting 3 or 4, but that is a specific conversation we're going to have. There are no other questions. Alexa, you can keep going into the structure, but I'm glad we kind of paused here and got some initial questions out for those, and we'll come back at the end as well. So go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, feel free to stop me if you need to. So I'm going to move to the structure and composition of these CRBs. There are a lot of common requirements for selecting the members of the board. Residency in the city is fairly obvious. Also, diverse composition that is reflective of the area. Sometimes you'll have no prior felonies or crimes of moral turpitude being a qualification. Sometimes you want to be careful with that one because, for example, crimes of moral turpitude could be pretty broad. It might be even minor drug crimes. So you might even want to specify more specifically what crimes you would be disqualifying. Also serving limited terms. So I'll talk a little more later about this, but a lot of times it's between 2 and 4 years, and they'll have staggered terms so that the board maybe doesn't, if you start to get a board that's really at odds with the current administration, having a staggered basis of doing that can sort of eliminate that problem. A lot of them cannot hold public employment or office. But sometimes there's maybe 3 members that can. A lot of them cannot have a law enforcement background, but then of course there are sometimes requirements that there are a few law enforcement members, and then no immediate family currently in law enforcement. As far as the number of members goes, there's really a broad range. So some of the smaller numbers, those usually are the auditor or monitor function. So that's why they just have the one member, and then they have a staff. But yeah, there are some as big as 23 in San Diego. I think when we did the median and average, it was around 10 or 11 or 12. And I think the amendment has an odd number, so you can pick something around there. And as far as law enforcement experience, I mentioned this a couple slides back. So some of the jurisdictions actually require some members to have law enforcement experience. They usually are not current sworn members, or sometimes just not even members of that particular police department ever in the past. But San Antonio, half of its board is comprised of former officers. New York City has 3, Philadelphia has 3. The ones that I specified with none, like LA and Houston, that means that there cannot be any. And then if I didn't mention, or if I didn't put one of the 18 cities on here, it's because they just don't specify. So there could or could not be members. Chicago has a rule that the members cannot have been a sworn member of the department for at least 5 years. And then another option for this is that Indianapolis and Baltimore have a few non-voting members. So this can, from what I reviewed in secondary sources, this can be helpful as far as officers knowing what occurs at training or the different tactics that are being used during the time. So it can be a good option to have some members of law enforcement. And if you're leery of having that, you can also have non-voting members that could just help more with the discussion. As far as length of terms, I was talking about this, there's really a variety, but usually from 2 to 4 years, and can usually only serve a couple consecutive terms so that you get some different people in and out. Of course, longer terms can be more cost effective because a lot of times there's a lot of training for these board members. For example, they might have to do a 3-hour ride along in some jurisdictions, or I think it's Baltimore has 8 hours of training each year that the board members have to do. And so each time you get a new member, they're having to learn a lot more and you're having to spend time on that. But on the other hand, it can be good to get fresh new ideas every few years. So that's something to think about. And then the selection process, there are also a variety of ways. The most common are either mayor, city council, or city manager appointed. And I gave some examples of these. Most of the cities have a combination. So they might, if they have 12 members, say they'll have 3 that are selected by the mayor, 3 by city council, and different combinations like that. Usually if they're mayor appointed, they have to be confirmed by city council. It's just something that I've noticed. And then sometimes the police chief or commissioner has input for a certain number of members. And then some of the less likely or more rare options would be like the FOP might get to choose a member, other organizations like the ACLU or NAACP, or there could be a totally separate selection committee for the board. And as I said, most of these have a combination of methods, I think, so that you get different types of people, more diversity.
Sorry, can I ask you
yes.
one question? So is there any city you've come across in which the citizens of that city actually vote, right? Like, so they would run in a district alongside us, like a city council member?
I did not see any in these top largest cities.
Okay, so like no voting by the public in any of these places?
Yeah, I didn't see that. I'm not sure if maybe smaller jurisdictions might do it though, but I can look into that.
Thanks.
But Alexa, aren't there instances where even if it's a mayoral appointment, there might be an application process to get onto the mayor's radar where he's just not handpicking, he or she's not as handpicking? Is that common as well?
Oh, yes. So I looked, for example, at Baltimore's, and there's an online application that you could fill out. And it seems fairly easy to get yourself in front of the mayor or city council.
Alexa, it's Kate Pisciatti. We could go back to the training. Did you see in other jurisdictions where people chosen were put through like a Citizens Police Academy or the like? Because reading through the information from Nicole or the National Association for Oversight, they stress that people that are on these civilian review boards need to have some, well, empathy and understanding for what police do and the fact that they need to make these, you know, second-by-second decisions, and so they need to have an understanding for the job. Is this the type of training you're seeing these people go through before they're placed on these boards?
Yes. So I know Charlotte for sure has something that's actually called, I think, the Citizens Police Academy. And so that jurisdiction will require several hours per year. And then also at the beginning, attending that academy to learn more about police procedure.
Great, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Some of these jurisdictions will require background checks and references that will be checked in on. Okay, so I'll move on if there aren't any more questions there. Okay, composition of staff. I alluded to this a little bit. It was a little difficult to find this information. So following this meeting, I'll be looking into it a little more deeply. But I know for sure that New York and Chicago have a very large staff of over 100, and I think they actually have over 150 each full-time employees. And then some cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco have smaller groups, but they still have independent investigators. Some other roles they might have are counsel or attorneys, maybe 3 or 4 of those positions, an executive director who's kind of running everything on a daily basis, public relations personnel, and then general clerical staff. And then there are some really small groups like Philadelphia, Dallas, Jacksonville, Fort Worth, and Baltimore. And then some of them are actually just volunteer based. And so those I'm usually seeing board members spend 20 to 40 hours per month reviewing or monitoring police investigations.
That's a good question that I would find helpful, maybe if the staff put it in a table for us where some of these cities, whatever model they're using is identified along with the kind of number of employees and the hours that a review board member is engaged, if there's some way to tag those together. Because I imagine there's a big influence on the workload of the different kind of breakdown there.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I can put together, do some research on.
And Alexa, is there somewhere in this conversation we talked about, are some of the actual board members compensated in some of the cities?
Yes, that was something that I began to look into yesterday, but I was finding information I wasn't sure was entirely reliable. So I plan to call the cities to see if I can find out through a public records request. But I did see some staff members getting paid around, a range of $50,000 to $150,000.
Okay.
Okay, so talking about money, the types of budgets you're going to need. So if you're having some of these full-fledged boards with, 100 or more full-time employees, like in New York and Chicago, it's going to cost well over $10 million. And you kind of see a drop-off for the jurisdictions where I was able to find this information. Once you get to more like $1 million or less, those are usually jurisdictions that do not have kind of a full service board. They might just be or a full fledged staff. Instead, the board members are just reviewing IA investigations and things like that. So that's kind of something you really have to think about on whether you want a board conducting, hundreds of investigations. And that was everything I had. So if you have any other questions on that slide or anything in the presentation, I'm happy to take them.
Any general questions before we kind of open up the discussion around some of these elements specifically?
I have a question. Alexa, this is Fred Benton again. Is there, what's the protocol based upon your review when you have parallel investigations taking place, both in terms of a civilian review board, a disciplinary action, and a criminal investigation?
So usually when that happens, you'll have both sides making a recommendation. So for internal affairs, that'll usually go through the chain of command in some way, and then they'll make a recommendation. And then on the board side, they'll do their own investigation, come up with a recommendation. And usually what you see is a process where the police chief at the top has to consider the board's recommendation and explain his or her reasons for either agreeing or disagreeing. But generally, it's rare to see the board actually be able to just override the chief's authority. There are some jurisdictions that have it, but it is fairly rare.
Because part of the risk in that process is that if you have, I guess, a number of things. If you have an officer who is made subject to one process that is administrative in nature, it certainly could have overtones or implications as it relates to any criminal prosecution. And I know in some instances they talk about a Chinese wall being established so that one does not spill over into the other. And then likewise, you have circumstances in which potential witnesses are subject to multiple interviews, which could develop inconsistencies down the line that are later exploited.
Yeah, those are really good points. For the first point, I was picturing two separate administrative investigations, but usually if a criminal investigation happens, you will halt the CRBs until after that criminal investigation occurs and then restart it if the officer is not found guilty of any criminal conduct.
Okay.
As far as the second problem with witnesses, being interviewed multiple times and maybe not wanting to be interviewed several times, that is a problem. It might be a reason for working out a system where you somehow decide not to conduct parallel investigations and decide who's going to take it, whether it's going to be IA or the board. And so maybe having specific categories that each one can investigate might make more sense.
Yeah, and then one other question. Let's say a complaint is submitted to a civilian review board, and that complainant also files a civil action against the officer against the city. What information, if any, from the board is discoverable either by subpoena or public records request for purposes of use in a civil litigation, or perhaps maybe even in the criminal prosecution?
So I don't know that I have a ton of information on this. I'm not sure how public records requests would work since it is part of a public employer body. But I do know that some of the boards have confidentiality protections for some of that information. But that's something I can look into more.
Okay.
Hey, Fred, to your point, I'm wondering if the Civilian Review Board could employ a lawyer that represents people who have a case that can go to court, and then that way anything that's done within the Civilian Review Board would be like underneath the purview of that lawyer and couldn't be a public records request. I'm totally like making this up in my head, but this is what I think makes sense.
I mean, that's an interesting concept. Then the question becomes then who appoints the attorney? Now, if someone comes in through counsel that they've retained, then that's a different matter. And I'm assuming that this would be a process that would allow for a complainant to come in with their own legal counsel. But in the absence of that, then somebody's going to have to make a decision as to the eligibility for the appointment of counsel and what the qualifications are. I don't know if that would parallel, just kind of thinking out loud, I don't know if that would parallel the same criteria that's utilized for the appointment of counsel in the criminal proceedings, or would it be based upon some other factor? That's the point.
That's definitely a good point, and I'll look into that. Oh, go ahead.
Now, I was going to say, just to kind of continue the discussion, so we've heard several models in terms of the power and responsibilities of different various cities, just in terms of getting some thinking from those we haven't necessarily heard from as much. What's resonating with you as it relates to, key responsibilities you believe the CRB must have? I mean, there may be some things that you saw that you say, hey, we can have this, we may not have to have it, it may not be essential, but as you think about the power of what we would want the Columbus CRB to look like, let's get some thinking around what pieces are resonating with you that you say we really need to explore for our model here. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think at a minimum, you want to have, you want to take the best of all worlds. And so you definitely want to have the authority and the power to conduct an investigation that would certainly include the ability to subpoena witnesses and subpoena or otherwise be able to acquire documents. It seems to me there might have to be some sort of a statutory authority created for this committee to be able to have that, have the power of a subpoena, which is a very powerful tool. And I also think that certainly having the diversity within the community, however that's defined, would be an important aspect as well. One of the things I don't know, and Alexa, let me ask you this: is there, in your review, a requirement for a diversity based upon political lines?
I was usually seeing it more based on race or ethnicity or gender, but I could see that being a valid qualification.
I'm not an advocate, I'm just asking.
Yeah, right. No, I didn't see that.
So I just threw these back up here in terms of what Alexa shared earlier, the common functions of CRB. As you look at these, are there any that you really would kind of put on the must-have for Columbus? Are there any that you would put on kind of the optional role when you think about the role of our CRB? Which pieces of these are really resonating with you one way or another?
I think the mediation tool could be a really powerful one to have. I also think there's something about reviewing sort of aggregate cases for disparities in enforcement action. So like I just even think about low level engagements like traffic citations, right? That's a low risk kind of engagement for a member of the public. But looking at that about, are we disproportionately seeing people of color being stopped and pulled over and cited for violations? And so looking at a systemic kind of level as well.
Okay. Somebody else is jumping in there. Go ahead.
Yep. I would jump in. I would add to that point in terms of looking at the systematic side of things as well to make sure you can address any patterns of behavior or practices that are occurring that are discriminatory and problematic. So again, to that point, I think you need to have a large staff for a board like this. And then when we talk about the investigative approach, I think it's important to push for a board that can not only make disciplinary recommendations, but a more rare case is actually the ability to enforce those recommendations. I understand it's going to be a harder thing to push through, but I think if you look at the scope of the issue that we're working with, I think it's going to be important to have that conversation.
Okay. Other thoughts? Anthony, I see your list there, just previewing on my screen. So we're making note of that as well. Thank you. Are there any of these that we feel like, again, might be on the nice side, but not essential for Columbus? So you see things like community outreach, you know, some of the other ones that you feel like are not necessarily integral to our CRB, but might be a good additional features. Is there any you would kind of put on the could have, but not essential list?
So as a public body, I think reporting is going to be an essential function that needs to happen on a regular basis.
That's a good point.
And I was going to say on the sort of must-have, I think having an investigative body is pretty important. And then also advising on ops, as it's described here, regarding policies, procedures, and customs as a way to sort of prevent things from occurring instead of reacting.
Maybe.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand your question. Like, are you saying, like, all of the things that we would want to see in a civilian review board, are we listing those things now, or what specifically are you asking the question about?
Yeah, that in essence is my question. Yeah, these are just a summary of the list, but if there's something that's not here, that would also be time to bring that forward. But I was asking specifically about the functions you see listed. Are there any of these we don't feel are essential for our board, but perhaps might be nice or a good thing to have, but not essential?
I'll send you a list after this.
I want to kind of circle back to the question on the advising on ops, and just maybe someone can provide some additional insight here. The police chiefs advisory council that's been established, and I believe they have terms and things, et cetera, to advise, I think, exactly on those types of things. And so I think I'd want to at least explore what that group is doing, how this group would be different, where their overlap or coordination makes most sense.
Yeah, I had the same point. I think there could be certainly an ongoing relationship here. Perhaps there's a CRB process where they would refer things to that police advisory group to advise on. But I think you're right. I think there's the infrastructure for that group is set up where the chief is looking for policy and procedure recommendations from that group, and it's already established. So that might be a functionality you want to have through partnership and not a direct conflict with the group that's already been established. But conversation.
Can I say a little bit more about that? No, I'm actually looking at a Seton Hall Law Review journal where they studied the top 50 or cities that have a citizen review panel. And one of the shortcomings of most of them are that they don't have some oversight of the policies and that sort of thing. Now, because you don't want it to be purely sort of reactive, right? You want them to be able to inform what sort of policies and training they're seeing that are problematic that need to be addressed. Now, if it needs to go through some other body, that's fine. I don't have any concern with that. But I think it's important to have some pathway of communication in order for this group to be effective.
That's good. So I hear your point around making sure there is a marriage. We may need to think through what that process is, but making sure that that function is not missed between one of the bodies, and perhaps it's our body making a recommendation to that body around policies, procedures that are not working as well for us, looking into that as a strategy. So we're making note of that as well.
If I can comment on that, I certainly think that would be an important function. But my concern becomes how broad a scope does this committee have, because you can be overwhelmed as well. And so in order to be the most efficient, it might be that maybe certain at least maybe, for example, that particular aspect is segmented off to another entity to handle that process of a review. I mean, just a thought, but this, as is outlined, will involve a tremendous amount of commitment of time as well as resources. And so I think we have to think about that as we're looking about as to how this is going to be structured.
Okay, noted.
Well, I have a question. Or a comment. So one of the things that I would definitely like to be thoughtful about as we go through this process is I don't think someone who has been abused should have to report to their abuser. And so how do we get people, if someone is filing a complaint that meets the criteria in which something the Civilian Review Board would review, how do we make it less stressful for the person to file that and to feel more comfortable about, I have to walk into a police station and drop off a police report that says that a police officer hurt me? How can we make that process easier for the victim?
So that's a good point, Alexis. In terms of where complaints are received, have any research around if those are independent of the police department, or do they always start there and then they get referred to the various boards?
No, there are actually a lot of boards that will take the complaints. Sometimes you can just submit a complaint online pretty easily and you'll get emailed by the board about it. So that's something you can definitely keep independent.
Okay. Making a note on that as well.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, in fact, I never envisioned in my thoughts about this process that the complaints would ever have to go through the police department, because that's extremely problematic.
Noted.
Hey, Mo, this is Matt. Our amendment specifically says that this board should receive complaints from citizens, so they will have that authority independently.
Good. I don't think there's any objectives around the room to that at all, right?
No, just sort of in addition, I guess I would say if someone submits through an IA process, but it's appropriate for the board, I want to make sure that that gets kicked over as well. So I think that's the flip side of it.
All right, so I heard Jasmine talk about some additional things she may want to put on the table. Any other thoughts about things that maybe didn't get, in terms of responsibilities for the Civilian Review Board, that perhaps are not on the chart, but you believe are really important to ensure we've got a strong board? Anything not covered that you want to bring forward now as power or responsibility for our group in Columbus?
I don't know if we've discussed it yet, but I think that community liaison function, as we hear different organizations or groups, neighborhoods throughout the community may have specific concerns to route to this board, that there's a role there.
Yeah, so I think I heard you saying, hearing kind of the collective voice of communities. It may not be a complaint formally yet, but it certainly is advising this group around things they want to pay attention to, keep an eye on, or might just not be going well within the neighborhoods or in parts of the city. And so having that more proactive approach, is that what you're thinking about?
Yep, I think you got it.
Okay, very good. Okay. So let's get into some other brass tacks pieces then that we kind of talked a little bit about earlier. The first will be, how do we seat this board in Columbus? We'll start to talk a little bit about the appointment or application process. I just listed a few things that we probably want to think about or talk about as a part of this conversation, but the ultimate question here is, how do we go from not having a board to getting a board, and then how does the board function to repopulate itself based on either some type of a term limit or some other process? So a couple questions to consider here, open to your thinking around. How does one become a member of the CRB? It's something I want you to give some thought to. Who makes the appointment? We've had a little conversation about that. It seems like the predominant model from the cities we've looked at is perhaps maybe a mayoral process. Does not mean that was not precluded by some type of application, and then maybe city council ratification for that. There could be some other models. Let's talk about it. You might want to think about, are the difference between the inaugural board we need to seat by the end of the year and then a subsequent process? So if we need to do something special for the first board in order to get them seated and up and running, and then think about additional processes for appointments subsequent to that. Let's talk about that. And then we talked about perhaps having staggered terms. And so your thoughts around how long a term of service would be. I think the average from the other cities was about 2 years. I think Alexa talked to us about. So thoughts on any of that in terms of how does the appointment and application or any process to get a board seated, how should that work? Any thoughts about that process?
Just a point of clarification, Brother Wright.
Yeah.
It's thought that the board will be established before the referendum has been passed, or we just set the parameters that are outlined within the referendum?
I think we are designing the board as if it will be seated either way, but I think the timing will probably be the appointments are happening after the referendum is decided. But I'll go to Matt and Kate for an official answer.
Okay.
You got it, Mo. I think you covered it.
Yep.
All right. So we're proceeding as if we're going to be successful, I think is the short answer to that.
Okay, all right.
Okay, well, I'll dive
Other
into
thoughts about it?
some of these questions. I think staggered membership is important. And just kind of following some of the comments here. So I would actually say a longer term, so a 4-year term that are staggered, especially given the training that I think it will take to get board members really comfortable in it. I would also say that when you kick off, because you need those staggered terms, that some of the initial terms may be less than 4 years. If we would consider term limits, I'm not necessarily suggesting it, but if you would only be able to do, say, 2 4-year terms, that those initial partial terms would not count as that total cap.
Got it. There's a couple things in what you said. I think I heard a 4-year recommendation, perhaps some less for the inaugural period. We need to talk about term limits and how you feel about that. And then perhaps given a grace period for those who are initially part of the board, that might not be, as we stand the group up, counted toward the initial number of terms that someone can serve. So again, just thoughts at this point. Other perspectives are certainly appropriate.
Yeah, I would jump in here. What I would suggest is some sort of hybrid approach in terms of the way appointments are made. So, perhaps some by the mayor, city council, and then I like the idea. I know some review boards have certain interest groups that are, whether it's ACLU, NAACP, that are kind of a part of this larger process around the justice system. I think there's got to be some way to ensure that their voices are heard in order to make sure that if there's any sort of mayor or city council process and it's not reflective of the community, for example, to have these other interest groups involved, I think it would be important.
Hey, this is Jasmine. Oh, someone else go? No, it's me. Okay. I have thought about this sort of modeling the expansion of city council and the creation of wards. I think some of these positions absolutely need to be elected. The people need to have a say in the process. So if we have all of the ward seats that are elected, and then that person, that council member from that ward is responsible for communications with them, and then the at-large seats can be appointed. But I'm okay with a hybrid, but I don't think that we need all appointed seats. I think the people of Columbus should have a say in who is advocating on their behalf. And I think as we expand council, there's a perfect model for sort of at-large versus district seats and the terms that they sort of run on.
I have a question. If I could just step in, go ahead.
Get the question first. Go ahead.
Am I muted? How do I do this here?
You're
You
good.
do hear me? Okay, I'm thinking, I agree somewhat with Jasmine. We already have a blueprint, I believe, on how individuals can be selected for this board. We have the area commissions. The area commissions run for office. that might be a mechanism that we can use to seat individuals for this board, have them elected by the individuals in their communities.
That's a model. Okay, very good. Mr. Muhammad, I think you were trying to get in there. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
So just a couple of suggestions as well. I would agree with the 4-year term that was kind of floated around. I would agree with also Kyle's suggestion about the hybrid approach. We want to get as much of a kind of a collective as possible. Some appointees are obviously very useful, but also folks directly from the community. And I was also seeing some of the requirements to be a board, and I think that some of them are just kind of out of reach for a lot of folks who are a lot more likely to be subject to police abuse. So I think seeing some sort of a quota or some sort of rule where it would require a certain percentage of members to be women, minorities from different, social economic backgrounds. So that way we're getting an accurate representation of the community. So.
Okay. I hear you saying some quotas and requirements specifically around the diversity. We want to see both racial, ethnicity, and gender represented on the group.
Yeah. Yes.
Hey, Mo, Kate Fashati here. We had a meeting last evening with some, the Jones Day Law Group who helped set up Chicago's. And interestingly, for as large as they are, they only have 9 people on their civilian review board. And so I think that we have to kind of keep that in mind, that we're not talking about an infinite number of people when we're talking about how we structure this. So I don't know how many we'll end up with, but I just kind of wanted to throw that out there before we get too far down the pipe.
Yeah. I think I made a note, Kate, from Alexa's presentation. Most advertised is about 10 to 12 based on the cities we looked at, and we probably, I think we're by charter, we're going to need to have an odd number. So probably maybe as small as 9, as big as maybe 12 or 11 or 13. But we'll talk about that particular question in a minute. But yeah, keeping it manageable from a group dynamic perspective is also going to be important here, and at the same time ensuring that diversity. So how do we balance those two is going to be something I need this group to consider as well. Other thoughts about so I have not heard as much about, I heard about term limits, I heard about the hybrid model in terms of placing people, particularly how do candidates become eligible. I heard one model which was around election of members. Other thoughts around how does one become up to join the board or be a member of the Civilian Review Board?
So I think direct election probably has some logistical challenges that we should look at before we go down that road. And so as an alternative, I do think there's something about a very easy application process that folks would go through. So it's not just, if we're looking at under an appointment model, if you're looking at some hybrid of council and or the mayor making appointments, and perhaps you have other organizations that are a part of that, have a process where any individual can submit into, consideration, and then you could have a sort of search committee or review committee that reviews those applications, and that would be another model you could use to get buy-in from some of the community stakeholders that were mentioned earlier.
Noted. And Nana's point around using our existing city infrastructure with area commissions and civics could also be a way to bring candidates forward. So what we plan to do with all this feedback, we're not making decisions tonight. What we want to be able to do is take it offline, bring it back to you with some pro and con type deliberation, and then let's get to some decision points. But this is all great input at this point, so keep it coming. Other thoughts about either the appointment process, applications, or terms?
If I could ask, if I could ask Alexa what her research has shown in that process.
So I usually.
Go ahead.
Oh, so I will usually see some members appointed by the mayor, some by city council, some by other potential interest groups. I hadn't seen the elective process, but there might be for some of the smaller jurisdictions. I just haven't looked into it.
I'll jump in there. The presentation that the National Association of Civilian Oversight, when they presented to council and the Safety Commission, they said that that was exceedingly rare of direct elections. And he made some comments about why he thought that was, our presenter, but that seemed to be least or whatever, if that helps.
Yeah, I would just jump in here kind of to the point about some of these pieces. I know there was one of the messages about some task boards with some eligibility around previous felony convictions or whatnot and not allowing to have that. I would actually encourage that not to be a disqualifier so that if you do have a previous felony conviction, that shouldn't disqualify you from serving on the board. I mean, if folks want to get specific about certain types of felonies, maybe disqualification, then that's one thing. But I don't think a felony conviction in of itself should be a disqualifier.
So Kyle, you're going right to the next body of conversation. So here I want to deal a little bit with the structure around things like criteria to serve, how the leadership of those boards will happen. We didn't talk as much about that, and the size. So a couple things to noodle over now. What attributes or skills should we seek for members to be seated? We had a slide earlier. We can go back to that if you want in terms of what other cities are doing. Are there parameters to Kyle's point that would exclude you from serving on the CRB? Let's have that conversation. It's going to be felony or some subset thereof. Let's talk about it. I don't know, Alexa, if you're going to have any thoughts around the leadership or how these boards are governed from like their chair or a president of the board or something like that. So let's talk about that. And then let's make some recommendations around the size of the eventual board. So floor is open around these aspects. Thoughts here.
Mo,
Yes, ma'am.
I'm thinking, how would the leader of the CRB be selected? I'm thinking that the group should select the leader.
So you're thinking a chair model, kind of like a chair, but chosen from within the group, elected within the group?
Yes.
Okay. Other thoughts on any of these?
I think this has to do with this. I remember there were Alexa talked about like advisory roles, and I would like to see like a police liaison advisory role and a youth advisory role, so that we make sure that we're including a young person's voice into the mix as well. I agree with Kyle. I don't think there needs to be a high school graduation requirement or a college graduation requirement. If you're there and you're willing to be helpful, you should be there. I would also say I would like to have some seats set aside for people who have been directly affected by this. I can read and watch as many documentaries as I want to about police brutality, but there's just something different about having been involved in it, and I think we should respect those people's experiences.
Thank you, Jasmine. Brandon, if you will help me out, the way my screen is set up, as I'm sharing, I can't see chat, but they only flash up. So if comments are made via chat, if you bring those to my attention, I'd appreciate it because I'm not able to see them and keep the screen going. I did, Jasmine, to your point about the youth and police liaisons or advisory roles, that is the next conversation we're going to have about kind of staffing structure. I believe you meant those as staffing positions within the board staffing structure. Is that right?
Roles, just so let's say we have 11 members, but we have 2 advisory roles. One's a police liaison and one is a youth from the community.
I'm with you. Okay.
Mo Capashati.
Yeah.
Just want to remind everyone that since this is a public meeting, the use of the chat function, that people who are watching the public meeting aren't privy to the chat. So we need to kind of keep everything out in the open. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate, for that reminder. Bo?
Here, I wanted to just weigh in. So I do agree with. Okay, I got. Yeah, something happened. Somebody muted me. I just wanted to say my thoughts are. I do agree with Kyle and that we should not have disqualifiers based on background. I do think that we should have an odd number of board members and it should be manageable. I'm thinking 7, 9, or 11. I see that someone put in the chat the idea of an executive director who's hired by the city to lead the board. I like the idea of a staff member who is there to support the board, but I don't believe that a staff member of the city should be the leader of the board. I think that they should be, board members and staff should be separate. Those are my thoughts.
I appreciate that, Bo. And in just a minute, Jason's going to come a little later and talk about some existing infrastructure the city has that might be some models. One is the commission model where folks are independent, but their decisions do flow to other aspects of city government. So we are going to give you some insights about some models that are at work. Not that we have to adopt those, but they would be a little more in line with keeping some autonomy at the same time, keeping the connection point. So noted there. Other thoughts? All right, so let me play the other side of the coin.
One last thing to jump in there. We talked about the felony not precluding you from being a member of the board, but I think we saw also some models disqualifying folks if they have immediate family members who are part of the force or were experienced with law enforcement within a certain amount of time, that kind of thing. So I think that's worth discussion as well.
And are you suggesting that be a criteria, or you're just throwing it out there for discussion?
I think for discussion, we need to talk about it and what's appropriate. I can see it going a few ways. So I'm interested in what the group thinks.
Well, I was certainly going there first with the felony piece, and let's come back to the law enforcement one in just a second. So around the felony conviction, in essence, if there are no subparameters, that would mean that a violent offender, regardless of type, and if we don't add any, years since conviction or years since time served parameters, could serve on this civilian review board. The question is, do you want that to be the case? Are there some qualifiers on top of that? Talk to me about, are there any exclusionary factors we need to mitigate to make sure we've got a balanced board who can objectively evaluate case-by-case basis?
Well, I'll weigh in on this. Fred Benton, I don't think you want to have a blanket exception of a felony conviction for a number of reasons. Because there is a risk of compromising the credibility of the committee. Certainly someone who has been through the experience of the criminal justice system, I think, has a valuable input. But for example, the question becomes, if somebody is still on some level of court supervision, is that an issue for purposes of serving on this committee? And there might be some potential conflict there, or at least from an appearance standpoint. The other thing is that certain types of offenses may be problematic. If you've got somebody who is a registered sex offender or who's engaged in child pornography, is that something that this committee's qualifications will be broad enough to encompass that? So I don't say that to say that I have a criteria or an idea, but I do think that we have to be careful in terms of how far wide we throw this net.
Sure. Okay.
Just to add to that as well,
Go ahead. Was that Kyle?
No, that's somebody else.
Oh.
I'm sorry, that was me. Sorry about that. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Just to add to what Fred was saying, I think that one of the biggest things that I definitely wanted to push was that to make sure that we knew why people were joining the board to begin with. So having an application process, an interview process where we know why they're joining. Not that I'm against someone who has had experiences with the criminal justice system, but if somebody's joining who has a personal agenda, whether they're for police, anti-police, that would kind of be go against what the board's goal is. That we stay kind of independent, that we're neutral. So I think that could be definitely a big factor to kind of consider. But as far as I agree with everything that was said thus far, felony should not be a disqualifier. Anything else that was mentioned, we should have as broad of a parameter as possible to get as much people possible we can.
Got it.
And there's
So
one
I
other.
think I hear you making the point of that the application process ought to at least try to judge, or at least ask the questions around intent for service, and maybe get at some of these questions, and you reserve the right to use those as factors or filters by which candidates are advanced, but not make it a blanket exclusionary on the felony piece at least. I think is what I heard.
Yes, yeah.
One additional comment I would make is that we're talking about a process that's going to involve very complex or potentially very complex factual scenarios. Certainly will involve an analysis of law and police procedures and policies. So I think that the members of the board certainly need to have, if not within their own personal background, some experience or expertise in that area, but certainly access to information that could guide the committee with respect to making those evaluations.
I think to that point and to a couple other points, I mean, there's some aspects that, I think it's important to leave open to the discretion of the appointing board, right? I mean, this working group was appointed and decisions were made to be reflective of the community. I think that is important. I think the worry is that we get too rigid on certain requirements that exclude people who might be overlooked, who don't necessarily fit within a specific set of criteria. So I think it's important for us to think about those things, but also have to be honest about the fact that some of this stuff is going to get negotiated through. So I don't know about how much early on parameters we need to be setting. I do know that there are some values that we can express, and one of those is I don't think people should be excluded for a felony conviction. Now, if folks want to have a conversation about certain types of convictions that might be an exclusionary factor, that's a decision that could be made. But I think just initially, I think we have to have a baseline that we don't, go under.
Yeah, that's good. I see you saying set the box, but not be too rigid about what's in it at this point as we kind of work through some of these early mechanics. And that's fine. I think today is about getting you a sense of how you would want this to work. And then we know we've got some additional thought to put into this on all these parameters. So point taken. Let me ask you then around the size of the board. We've heard kind of a range, and then Bo laid out perhaps a range from 7, 9, or 11. If we, keeping in mind we have some diversity goals of the group we want to maintain here, size-wise, what number of members resonate with you as a jumping-off point?
I believe council is going to 11 members. Or is it 9? Can somebody help me on which number they're going to soon?
I think it's 11.
Okay, so I think that it should be 11. Let's just have it be reflective of our representation at the city level.
Any objections to using 11 as our working framework? Okay. And then
I would just
go ahead.
Sorry, I want to jump in. I would say I think that could be a working framework. I think conversations about budget, staffing, which is we're about to go to, I think ties into that number.
Agreed. So to your point, part of this is we're not asking you to kind of do the org chart today, right? But you heard a range of options Alexa laid out earlier. Some of the boards who play more of just a monitoring role or perhaps just a review role were not as big in terms of staff as some of the boards who had investigative and subpoena power and were making top-line recommendations to the chief or others. So that said, I guess the question I would ask you to think about is, are there just fundamental roles and responsibilities for the staff? We're not talking about the board now, we're talking about the staff who supports the board. Are there just roles that you would really want to make sure are represented in our staffing structure as we build out what this department or unit will look like? So some examples of that would be, there might need to be a number of investigators, right? There might need to be, whatever our infrastructure is around accepting complaints, there might be a role or need for those. So just talk to me in terms of roles and responsibilities that you feel to be really critical to the staffing structure. We can build out the model later, but just making sure we have thought about all the potential kinds of functionality from a staffing perspective that we need to consider at this point. Any thoughts on that?
Hey, Mo, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
This is Anthony Wilson. So if you're going to take complaints, then your administrative staff is going to have to be pretty robust because there could be a multitude of complaints coming in. The other part to that is if there's training involved, you're going to have someone who's involved in that aspect of it as well.
Noted.
Well, I was going to say, I think Aaron brought up a good point earlier about it. Internal affairs is going to be, as it currently is, wouldn't be doing as much. Then maybe we would need to know, like, how many internal affairs investigators do they have currently? And is there some sort of analysis that could be done to understand how many complaints they see currently, and then how that might reflect in the staff for the citizen review panel?
Got it.
If I could weigh in again, perhaps maybe, as was suggested before, we should just say that the committee will have adequate number of investigators as determined. Because until we know the scope of our responsibilities, we don't know exactly what all the tools it is that we will need.
Yeah, I agree with you, Fred. I think it's not even necessarily about number at this point. It's just the fact that we know we will need an investigative team is really what all I'm looking for today. What other functions might we think about that would really make sure this department has all the resources it needs to be independent? That's really what we're thinking about.
Sure.
I think you're also going to need some component of research and communications, both for that, looking at those systemic challenges or patterns of behavior, and then the reporting and communication functions and the community liaison function we talked about under communications branch.
Got it.
Yeah, I think I think Aaron's point, and it might have been Aaron earlier, somebody else said also about the policy stuff. So you're going to have someone that's doing research. So I think it would make sense to have a policy liaison, someone that is doing research and also talking with the police department and talking with council about sort of like what is possible. Okay, we're seeing this problem. This isn't fixed with the civilian review board. How do we use the voice of the people to help craft policies that are going to change these things? And then I don't know if this needs to be like a role, but there's going to need to be some money set aside for like technology stuff. Like how do you keep a secure database of all of the files that you've gotten? And I imagine like servers and security measures are not cheap.
Information security as a function and as a goal and responsibility, I think is, yeah, I got it. Okay.
Alexa, this is Janae. I was just wondering, I think you mentioned in your presentation that some of the boards had legal counsel on staff. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, I saw a few that had like 3 or 4 attorneys that advise the board.
What was typically their purpose, if you were able to figure that out?
I didn't really look into any specifics, but that's a good follow-up.
And Alexa, to pick up on that, do those attorneys play all internal research support roles, or are they doing any type of litigation or getting involved in litigation at all?
I was seeing it more in like an advice and counsel role.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's actually how I was thinking about it as well, having like an in-house lawyer to the board, not necessarily the arm that might litigate something should it come up.
Right. Okay. Got it. Y'all cooking today. All right. Very good. I get some good feedback here. Other thoughts about the staffing structure, key roles, responsibilities we want to make sure are part of the staffing structure? Any other thoughts around that?
Hey, Mo, Kate Pashadi.
Yeah.
City Council is only expanding by 2 seats, so only to 9.
Going to 9. Okay. Okay.
I think all staff members should have to live in the city of Columbus.
So this is Laura Mo, from the City Attorney's Office.
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. A couple things. Both state law prohibits us from having a residency requirement for living within the city of Columbus. And the second problem that was mentioned before, just to keep in mind, in terms of whether or not attorneys can be on staff, by city charter, the city attorney's office is the legal advisor to public entities that are within the city of Columbus as well.
Okay.
With that
So,
second, a way to.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So with that second issue that's brought up, I mean, maybe there's a way to have a city attorney placed within, kind of the day-to-day function of this role instead. So I think there's a way around that.
Right. Right. And this may get into what Jason's going to talk about, but I know the commissions tend to have kind of counsel that is from the city attorney's office in some cases. But don't we have that requirement for some of our commissions? I'm thinking about Rec and Parks in terms of the residence requirement, or did that go away?
In terms of the residency requirement, there might be if you had elected type officials, but the specific comment that was made was about whether or not the staff had to be residents of the city of Columbus.
Noted.
Right.
Got it.
Right.
But the board could be required to be residents of the city of Columbus.
Yes.
Okay. Noted.
I think there might be a place for, a bucket for consulting, because I don't think we're going to know what we need all together. And so I don't know if there'll be like a small bucket for consulting. And again, I don't have a clear definition of that, but it might be good as this board forms, they might realize they need additional expertise that wasn't within the charter. So something to consider.
Got it. Okay. Making sure we leave some room, probably budgetary room, if nothing else, for outside counsel and advice as some of these things develop, I think is what I hear you
Correct.
saying.
That's right.
Okay. Right. All right, we're going to do a couple things in the interest of time. I don't want to open up Alexa earlier did talk through some of the complaint processes in other cities. That's probably going to be a conversation we need to come back to at our next meeting in terms of how we want those complaints to flow through. I think we have a general sense from the presentation about how some other cities are doing it. I think we've already said as a function, we want our board to independently receive those complaints, but the flow of those things, I want to be able to fully have that conversation. So with your permission, I want to move that maybe to our next meeting to kind of get involved in that just a little bit more in the interest of time today. With that, I do want to then, let me come to Jason, because we were just talking about models for how we might stand this group up and how do we both have our Columbus City connection and at the same time be independent. And so we thought about some of our boards and commissions that are already operating under city government that might be a good model for this. So, Jason, you able to kind of give us a brief lay of the land on how some of those things work and how we might some things to think about in terms of structure here?
Sure can. I'm still trying to figure out where you found that picture.
I have no idea. That's a Brandon thing. I'll let you guys duke that out offline.
Yeah, I'll talk to Brandon offline. So real quick, this will be, a lot of this has already been covered. So, and many of the work group here has already sat on boards, but the structure that typically we look at when we're putting together these boards and how it relates to the relationship between staff and responsibility, because you do want to have that autonomy between the two. So this is basic information again, and I'm just going to cover it high level and we can get into questions if need be. So the rule of thumb is the board governs and the staff manages. So when you look at a board, the responsibilities of an organizational board of its directors include providing direction, oversight, and resources, either for the organization or the organization staff or both. So when you look at the direction of the board and how they govern the staff and management, the direction of the board develops the mission and organization and consistently monitors that organization and how they align to the mission. So looking at this independent civilian review board, what we would ask them to do is the board to set forth the mission and the goals, and then allow the body to take that mission and those goals forth. The oversight of the board, the oversight oversees the general work of the board, of the organization as a whole. So it'll look at the organization as a whole, it'll look at what the inspector general is doing, what his staff is doing as a whole, but on the day-to-day operations won't be as involved because, again, dealing with, Alexis touched on it earlier, you can get into the weeds, but then are you then biased when you make the decision, the final decision, when it comes to what will happen to the officer or what have you. So you want to make sure that you have that separation, and I believe Fred Benton spoke on that as well. So you can, again, not have any biases. When we talked to Chicago yesterday, they talked a little bit about different board members needing to recuse themselves. And so if you have a large number of board members recusing themselves, you can't make a vote on that particular complaint. So that's something to keep in mind, that you have that separation. And then when looking at resources, this was something that we just touched on. Again, the board or the board chair will talk with the inspector general about the general focus and funding the operation, the budget. That budget then will go to the finance department and the mayor's office to review and deliberate on whether or not we're able to fund this, whatever the board and the inspector general decide as far as, and then there could be some fundraising, well, not in this particular situation. In other board structures, there's fundraising opportunities, but in this particular structure, I don't think that's allowed or legal. So those are real quick three areas that when we're looking at the board roles and responsibilities, looking at and how it relates to the staff's role and responsibility. Very direct, again, nothing that you haven't seen already or yourself have been a part of, but really wanting to narrow that down into those three buckets of direction, oversight, and how the resources could possibly work. Thank you, Mo.
Yeah. So I think the takeaway there is just to keep in mind that we are developing, in essence, a new city department of some sort, right? I think that's in essence what we'll end up being, regardless of what it's called. It will probably operate as its own department and not a subset under either the mayor's office or under the division of police. And so there is a level of autonomy there, but it will have policies and procedures and city employees similar to other city departments within city government. So just want to make sure you were clear on that. Any questions about structure, either as, and these are just models we're sharing today, but in terms of how you want to see the structure of this group stood up or implemented, any thoughts or comments there before we move into general discussion? Good to go? All right. That said, we're in the last few minutes. We always want to leave an opportunity for you all. If there's we've got a lot done today, first of all, so thank you for your feedback thus far. It's exactly where we wanted to get the ball started. And your thoughtful consideration is helping us to kind of build this train as it's going down the track. So thank you so much. We also want to leave an opportunity for other things you want to put on our minds or minds of your colleagues around this topic in terms of building a strong civilian review board. Any thoughts there about our work together or our intended outcome? The floor is open as well.
I have a general question about the FOP contract, if that's okay.
Yes, I think Laura's still on. She's probably the best person to answer that.
Cool. So, if I'm not mistaken, my understanding of what happened in Minnesota was the chief of police said the FOP will no longer be the bargaining unit on behalf of officers for the Minneapolis Police Department. Can we do that? Can the chief of police say, you no longer represent us, we're going to find somebody else to negotiate on our behalf? Because it seems like the contract is the thing that gets in the way all of the time. But if the FOP is no longer allowed to bargain for these awful contracts, then does that get us around our problem?
So this is Laura, and I'll toss this out by saying I'm by no means an expert in labor law, and it is a very complicated area of the law. And if Alexis is still on, maybe she can jump in. But what I would say is I don't know the circumstances in Minnesota, but as it was described, that is not something that the chief would be capable of doing. The bargaining unit within the city of Columbus was appropriately bargained for and certified as the bargaining unit to represent the entity, the employees who are working within the division of police. There are state laws regarding what an employer can and cannot do once there's been a properly certified bargaining unit, and there's nothing that has occurred at this point in time that would have changed that current legal status. And if Alexis, are you still on? Alexa?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I don't know what Minnesota's law is like, but I know in Ohio, the labor laws are pretty robust on behalf of unions. But I would probably defer to Ron Linville for any specifics.
So that's our preliminary answer, and then Alexa, if you want to if Ron thinks differently, just have him weigh in with us, we can get an answer back to the group. Other thoughts or comments?
Just quickly, I just wanted to kind of revisit our schedules. I know when we spoke, we had talked about the 4 to 6 p.m. schedule, and I wanted to see possibly whether folks would be okay to doing a 5 to 7 potentially. I know some folks are working from home. Unfortunately, some of us are not very fortunate enough, and we do have to kind of be at work until 5. So I kind of wanted to revisit that idea. Thank you.
So we're looking at, so right now I think we've communicated the next meeting date, Matt, is that correct? Or do you folks have it?
You're on mute, Matt.
Sorry. I don't believe, Mo, that we communicated the next meeting date yet. We were going to mention that this evening. Okay. Do you want me to talk about it now? Or
yeah, go ahead. I was going to see if there was flexibility on that day at least to accommodate the request, which is, hold on, I have that somewhere here. So we can talk about adjusting this time if that's the case.
Thanks, Mo. We were looking at September 1st, as Mo has on the screen, for our topics for that. Today we talked about the setting up of the Civilian Review Board. For the next meeting, we're going to follow the same format, talk about setting up the Department of the Inspector General, roles and responsibilities, how the IG is selected, the administration of the department, funding, operations, functions, things like that. We have on our site, hopefully everyone has now accessed your specific site for this. In the materials work, we have some materials that the IAB does, their procedures and things like that. I think some of that work would be similar to the work that the Inspector General would be doing. So I think familiarizing yourself with that would be great for homework. And we, at this point, expect to have the president of the Chicago Police Board present some of this material to you at that meeting and answer any questions that you may have.
So I guess the question to the one point that was made, is the group able to adjust down from 4 to 5 o'clock and keep our attendance? We did kind of visit this at the first meeting, but we've got a request to take another look at it. Any objections to going an hour later? And maybe we meet in the middle as well would be an option if you wanted to maybe do 4:30. Might help us a little bit, but any objections to that, or are you okay making the adjustment? See, Jonathan,
Nana,
thank
you're
you.
on mute.
No, I can't support that one. I'm still.
You want to stay at 4?
I can't support the later time. I'd support 4 to 6.
Okay. Is there, well, let me hear from some more of you first, either in the chat or verbally. Under your meeting,
Yeah,
obviously you gotta make it work.
I'm with the 4 to 6, just after a work day, and then having to go straight into the meeting and be done, all the way till 7 is a tough one. I understand some of the gaps that folks have, but that's just kind of where I'm at. But obviously, I'll make what I can work.
4 to 6 is great for me.
Okay.
I'm open and can do either.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Okay, so I'm either hearing a lot of no preference or an affinity towards the 4 time more than I am the 5 time. We may just have to be flexible, and certainly, I think it was Brother Muhammad who might have had some conflict. If we can't, certainly we're always available to catch folks up between meetings if you do miss something. Obviously, we want to be as democratic as possible and go with the will of the group, but we may be able to look at some alternative times down the road, but particularly in the short term, sounds like folks want to not go too far to their evening, which is understandable. So let's go with the date we have established right now, and again, if we need to deal with individual members and getting you up to speed, either pre or post the meeting, we will prepare to do that. So please make note of the September 1st date, 4 to 6. Agenda forthcoming, but Matt laid out some of those dynamics already in terms of what we'll be discussing at the next meeting. Matt, I'll come back to you for any closing remarks beyond what you already said, or Kate, feel free to jump in there as well.
No, Mo, thanks a lot. Just again, thank all the members for their work on this issue. So thank you.
Kate, Jason, anything?
Thank you all.
No, I echo Kate and Matt. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, folks. Worked you hard today. We're just getting started, though, unfortunately. So, fortunately and unfortunately, but we're going to keep the train moving. We'll see you again in about 2 weeks. We'll be recapping today's conversation. Both of the PowerPoints will end up posted for you to be able to access as well as we prepare for meeting 3. So, with that, we'll prepare to close. Talk to you in a few weeks, and let's keep at it and continue to build something great here in Columbus. On behalf of our partners of the city, thank you so much, and certainly on behalf of Rayma, thank you for staying in here with us all day. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Mo.
Thank you,
Thanks, Mo.
Take care.